Hi, I'm Keita. In this video, I'd like to share with you how I approach drawing a cat in graphite pencil. I'll talk you through step by step the tools and processes I use for this type of drawing. So let's start with the tools I like to use so you can follow along if you like. So today I'm using a Canson sketch paper, a set of Staedtler pencils, an eraser, blending sticks and a face tissue. You'll also want to work from a reference picture if you want to get that realistic look. And since we're working in graphite pencils, I suggest editing your reference photo to grayscale on your phone or your computer before you start using it as a reference, because it makes it a bit easier to see all the values that you'll be concentrating on. And that's kind of without the distraction of colour. I find it a little bit distracting sometimes to look at colour when I'm focusing on values, so it's good practice. And also, just to go back to realism, I think it's really important to use a reference for that reason. So if you do want to create a realistic effect, it's important to have your reference, preferably a good reference. This was a commission that was drawn not from particularly good reference, so then you have to use your imagination to fill in the blanks, which can also be kind of fun sometimes, but it's nice for practice sake. If you can get a really good reference picture, you're more likely to achieve a realistic look. And just to start any pencil drawing, the first thing that I usually do is create a really good light sketch of the outline of whatever subject I'm drawing. So in this case, that's this cute little kitty cat in this cute little pose with his tummy showing. And so I just like to keep my pencil strokes really light so that they're super easy to erase. Because if it's too dark, then your eraser can sometimes leave marks and you can still see those smudges underneath, and it kind of spoils your overall picture. So my other tip would be to use a few grades of pencil. So start with thinking about light and shadow. And I like to contrast on the darkest areas first. Concentrate on the darkest areas first. So the picture itself has certain areas in it that almost look black or like really dark, so I like to pick out those parts and go in with those first, just so I have a nice point of reference between the lightest part of the drawing, which would be the colour of the paper underneath, and the darkest shadows, and that way I can build and adjust the values as I go according to how they compare to those two light and dark areas. And when sketching in the shadows, I like to imagine or look at my reference to see what direction the fur could be growing in that particular area, and then sweep my pencil in that general direction. But mainly I am paying attention in the beginning to how light or dark the areas are for that first initial part. And then I go in with a blending stick. I think it's also called like a tortillon. I don't know how to say it. Maybe you can let me know. Let me know in the comments. I'm just going to say blending stick for now because that's what I call it. And smooth out all the shadows using that. And it just creates a nice transition, and then any graininess caused by the texture of the paper that I don't want to see in that particular bit, it kind of helps to smooth that out. And then sometimes though, I like to keep the texture in some areas, particularly when I'm drawing fur. Sometimes I like the texture, but I'm mainly talking about using it in those areas where the shadow needs that smoother transition from dark to light. I also tend to use my blending stick as though it's an additional pencil for shading some mid-tone areas and just softening a little bit. When pencils can seem a little harsh of a line, then it's kind of nice to use it almost like a smudgy light pencil. When using it for skin tone and smoother surfaces though, I tend to steer clear of it, as you've got to be really careful there, as it can give you a streaky look really easily. But for drawing fur, I find that streaky effect pretty helpful. It just takes some playing around and practice to figure out which tools work for you when, and the way you use it. And the way I approach a graphite pencil drawing like this is different than I'd approach if I had the same commission to draw the same cat if it was an acrylic paint, watercolor, ink, oil, or any other media. It's always unique to the media, and this is just how I've found it helpful to use these tools, so I thought it might be helpful for you too. So after that, I like to go in with a darker pencil, something like a 2B-ish. I say ish because I often end up picking up, especially when I'm drawing fur, like different depths of pencil to get the different depths of colour, because fur is kind of mixed in streaks of light and dark and mid-tones, so it's kind of nice to switch around your pencils, but I kind of stick around something like a 2B, and then I just use that to re-establish any of the darker areas that might have got lost in that blending phase. But this time I'm mainly paying attention to the texture of the fur. Sometimes I find it helpful to imagine what it would be like to feel the fur as if the cat was sat in front of me or sat in my lap, and it helps me to think about how I'd approach the length of each pencil stroke. Like if you were stroking the cat, would the fur on that part of their body be shorter or would it be longer? So that would help to inform how long my pencil strokes would go or how short my pencil strokes would go. Maybe that's probably really weird. Is it just me? Probably. Anyway, so when I'm thinking about drawing the fur, it's like individual lines, like drawing from the root of the fur to the tip of each strand, and I don't do those back and forth strokes because it ends up losing that realistic look of fur, and it can be tempting, especially when you're just beginning, to use that back and forth action with your pencil because it's quicker to fill in areas, but it just is totally worth it. I think it's worth putting the time into. Just lift your pencil with each stroke to give that impression of the fur. And then the next thing I do is to go in with an eraser to clean up any muddied areas. I actually used 2 erasers during this piece, so I use like a regular eraser similar to the one I showed you in the beginning, and then I also have, it's kind of cool, I'll have to figure out what brand that is, maybe I'll link it in the description below, but it's a pencil eraser, so you can sharpen it like a pencil and it gets a really fine point to it, and I use that as well to kind of pick up any highlight in the fur details, and for that, rather than placing every single strand of fur, I choose random areas to put wispy fur details, and I alternate the pencil in curved directions, as fur isn't usually perfectly straight when you look at it, which gives it the overall impression and feel of fur. It's kind of a stylistic choice, but feel free to draw on all the fur, every single line. You might just be sat there for a while. Probably a long time if you to draw every single strand of fur, but however you decide to draw, that ends up being the style that you draw in, and that's one of the ways that you develop your own style too. Something else I like to do when drawing a portrait of any pet is to give them like a little bit of a hint of an environment or a full environment, so they don't just look like they're floating in space. And particularly for this piece, because this kitty looks kind of strange in this position without being in context, I felt like it was pretty important to give them a background. Sometimes I'll just put like a horizon line or just a little bit of a shadow, but it really helps to put the cat into context, or whatever animal you're drawing, but in this circumstance we're talking about a cat. And so for this cute unique cat pose, it makes sense that he's on a comfy bed. Now all of a sudden when you start to see that come together, it kind of makes sense with the pose. And I want to achieve the shadows in the crease fabric with a smooth shadow transition. So instead of using the blending stick, as I mentioned before, to get that smoothness, I use a facial tissue wrapped over the end of my finger rather than a blending stick, to just ease the graphite into a smooth gradient, and it really fills in some of the gaps on the paper so you don't get that texture. It makes it nice and smooth. And with fabric, I then like to use an eraser either the pencil looking eraser or just a regular eraser to bring the highlight back to the raised areas and give back more of that creased look. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on how to draw a cat. Make sure to like and subscribe and all that good stuff, and I hope to see you soon with another video. Thanks for watching.